we're incredibly pleased. As you know, Bernhard and Stefano and I have all studied at the C.G. Jung Institute in Küsnacht in Zurich. And one of our teachers, and she was also my supervisor for a bit, and the head of studies is Renate Daniel, who is amazing, I would say. I think I can fairly say one of the things it's interesting to consider. I always tend to be really interested in personality types and the way people communicate. Is Dr. Daniel is both terrifically smart, terrifically reasonable, thinking type, but also all of the feeling types adore her. They know that she will be nicer to them than, for instance, I will. So it's interesting that someone would be developed enough that they would have that range of skills, that range of experience. That's quite wonderful. I'm letting people in. So we're talking about, we're launching Dr. Daniel's book, The Self, Quest for Meaning in a Changing World, which is published by Daimon, which is Robert Hinshaw, who is also here now. Hello, Robert. In 2020, it's actually based on a German book from 2018. And I will go ahead and read her biography very briefly. Renate Daniel, MD, a specialist in psychiatry, psychotherapy, and psychoanalysis, has been in private practice for many years. She's a lecturer, teaching analyst, supervisor, and director of programs at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, as well as actively teaching at the Jung Societies in Basel, Cologne, and Stuttgart. She's the author of Taking the Fear Out of the Night, Coping with Nightmares, which is also Daimon Verlag 2016, as well as a number of published articles and several other books in German. So welcome, Renate, and if you wouldn't mind, if you can tell us a bit about your book.
Yes, thank you very much for this wonderful, amazing introduction. And perhaps, yes, I will talk a little bit about this book. First of all, I wrote it in 2017 in German, and it was published, as you mentioned, in 2018. And I asked myself, in order to prepare this evening, why did I write this book? Why was I interested in this topic? And there are at least three aspects. First of all, it's about Winnicott's idea, and many often Jungians talk about it or discuss it, Winnicott's idea of the so-called false self. And from a Jungian perspective, it's not possible to talk about the false self. And that's why I thought it's important to understand what's Jung's concept. And it's not about convincing somebody of this concept, but to know, especially as a Jungian, what are the pillars or what are the main aspects of this concept. Furthermore, the second intention of me, or why it's so important, is the idea of the dark self or the shadow of the self, because many Jungians, when they hear the word self, they are overwhelmed. There is something that's very positive. The eyes are bright and they see the positive aspects, and for sure that's important. But there is something dark, there is the shadow, and that's important to know something about that. And then I'm interested always in the relevance of Jung's concepts or ideas for today. And that's what I want to discuss. Yeah. So it's not only about the history of Jung, but really, is it helpful for us today? Do we benefit when we know something about that? So let's give a short summary of the concept, let's say the definition, and there are four aspects. First of all, I guess most of you know that Jung, there is no single description or no single concept, but there are several aspects. And one aspect is that he said or described or gave the definition, the self is the totality of the person. It's the whole person. And if you really try to understand that, you already know that it cannot be only the bright aspects. The totality of the person includes the shadow, includes something dark, and the dark can be the evil, or it can be something that we repress or something negative. But dark also means there is something we can't see or we haven't seen until yet. So these are dark aspects. And the totality of the person means that the body is included, because the totality means everything. And that's very important for today, because we have problems, or many people have problems with the body or neglect the body and so on. So already this definition, if you really find a resonance with the totality, then you know that there are many aspects that are important. And then most of you know that he said, well, the self, it's about the center of the person or the personality. And this already shows that the self is something other, something different than the ego. It's not the ego. And there are many people who never read Jung, and I will only give you, let's say, a description from the author Renate Daniel, a Danish author. And she said, what do I do when I'm writing a novel or whatever? And she said, and I like that very much, it's not my ego finds the word. So she understands, or it's not good to say she understands, it's the experience, not my ego finds the word. It flows through my finger. Isn't it a wonderful description that she can differentiate, or that she knows there is a kind of source inside of her? Or for example, the French musician Louis Depardieu, he said, it's not about the ego. The ego, or my ego, has to be open. So there is a source, something is coming, and the ego is necessary to express or to bring into the world what the self wants you to bring. Yeah. So that's for me, these are wonderful descriptions, or an approach to describe what it means, what the self is. And to say it in a more neutral way, you could say, well, there is sometimes an inner voice, or there is an idea that comes to the ego, or it can be a knowledge immediately, or for you don't know why, but you know something, and so on. So this is the center of the personality, a kind of source that comes to the ego. And then you know that the third definition is that the self is the God within us. Yeah. So something divine is in us. Yeah. And that's of course not the ego. And the fourth, let's say the fourth aspect he describes is that the self, you cannot distinguish the self from the image of the ego, or the imago Dei, yeah? The image of God. Yeah. And when you take the Greek word enthusiasm, means that your ego in a way is within this divine, the realm of the divine, or you are in the self, or close to the self, or connected to the self. So it's always about to differentiate between the ego and the self. So this is, let's say, these are the main pillars or the aspects of the self. That's the definition. And I think that's what is important to know if we want to discuss the concept or the relevance or whatever. So the third aspect I want to summarize is the consequence of this concept. You all know we are talking about self-realization, or self-confidence, or self-healing. So you see, isn't that important to see, especially today when we are talking about trust or confidence, that the roots of this is not in the ego, but in the self. So confidence is rooted, or is coming from the self, or even healing. It doesn't come from the ego, it comes from the self. And of course, I tried to summarize some aspects of his concept, but we cannot know what the self is. It's only an approach. But healing or confidence or realization, this is rooted in the self. And of course, self-realization, for me, that's very interesting, because it seems that the self wants to come into the world, and you can ask yourself, when you have an intention or an idea or a wish, does it come from the ego or does it come from the self? So, for example, I give you now a personal example. Many of you know that I'm a hardworking person. And you can ask yourself, or I ask myself, to be honest, is this a compensation? So does my ego want to compensate something? Or is it really a task from the self? And this already leads to the question of the dark self, because when you try to how can I say, perhaps you know some authors, or you know some musicians, or you even know some scientists, physicians, when there is a task from the self, it's not always the case that this task leads to a balanced life or to your health. It can be that this task is not very positive for your life or for your health, but it has to be done. And then it's quite different if it's a compensation or it's a task of the self. But that's a mystery. And perhaps you need, I don't know, but sometimes I have the idea that you have to be rather close to death or in a difficult situation, that you know if it's if you compensate something, if it's something neurotic, or if it's the task of the self. For me, that's a very fascinating question. Yeah. So 2 more aspects, and then I will give you the time. As most of you know, for Jung, he said the self is the most important archetype. And when we try to further approach this concept or the archetype, there are 2 other aspects. First of all, it's about the structure. It's about the structure of the self. And you know the myth of the tree of knowledge in the Bible, or you know from the Greek mythology what Prometheus did. So the tree of knowledge means, first of all, when there is the power, or when there is the self, what we sometimes call God, it's about that a human being, in order to be conscious and so that the ego can be born, you have to disobey. It's not about to obey, but it's disobedience, and you have to cross borders. You cannot always accept limitations or boundaries. And Prometheus stole the fire, brought the fire to mankind. Yeah, and that's very important. Yeah, to see that these myths are describing something that shows how can mankind develop, because the consequences for the ego are that we get some freedom, and this means freedom from nature. Yeah, so let's say this in a way, there is this let's say the relation between the self and the ego means the ego or mankind tries to get something, to rob something from the self in order to free oneself or to free mankind from nature. So we have more possibilities, we are independent, and the ego or mankind is able to make decisions, but then we are responsible. And sometimes we are inflated, but this is in a way sometimes a prerequisite to develop something. But of course, it's dangerous. And it's about power, and it's about humility. So the question is, am I able as an individual, or is mankind or a society able to accept that that the self exists, which is very powerful, and am I able to be humble, at least sometimes, yeah? And to find, let's say, an appropriate relationship. So this is about the structure. And then I only want to mention in 1 or 2 sentences, we all know that we have images of God, that we have images of the self, and that there is always, through all the epochs and in all cultures, there is a tendency to project, yeah, to have projections in the outer world, and it's about the highest value of a culture and in an epoch, and that as soon as there are taboos, or as soon as you fascinate and you are no longer free, from a Jungian perspective, one would say, aha, there is something like the self or something archetypal behind. And right now, I guess it's something very actual, you know, that there are these theories that Bill Gates is in a way in the background of this corona virus and all the stuff that happens around the coronavirus. So you see that it's like a godlike projection, because he must be so powerful to arrange that it's really a projection of the self. Because in the past, when you go to the Middle Ages, or then you see usually it was God who was responsible for a pandemic or for an earthquake, and people thought, well, what did we do so that something evil or something difficult like that can happen? And today, that's interesting, and that shows that the image of God is changing or is modified. Today, there is the tendency to project something like that on human beings. Yeah, that's very interesting. So now only a few words concerning the dark self. Jung mentioned that that's a quote, without integration of the evil, there is no totality. And as I already mentioned, the totality is about the self. So it's about the evil, it's about the shadow, and the individual shadow and the collective shadow. And the collective evil in the Middle Ages was called the devil. Yeah. So it's about the devil. So we are meeting really very evil forces. Yeah. And you all know that the evil is fascinating. Yeah. The evil can fascinate. And I guess it fascinates many people because it's really different compared to boredom, to emptiness, to an inner void, to the nothing. Many people suffer that there is an emptiness inside of them, that there is not any value, that they have no meaning. But when you are close to the evil, then there is some fascination. And of course, that can be dangerous. The dark self, from a Jungian perspective and from a psychological perspective, the dark self forces us to sacrifice something. And there is even the willingness to sacrifice something. You all know that in the Mayan culture or in the Aztec culture, they sacrificed human beings. And perhaps today we are irritated because we would say, well, how can you sacrifice human beings? How can you kill them? Because it seems to be important, because you want the gods to be pleasant, to be friendly, so that nothing terrible happens. But now I want at least a little bit, provoke you. I want to provoke you, because what is the actual situation? Many societies, many natures, they do sacrifice something. What do they sacrifice? They do sacrifice the needs of children. they do sacrifice mental health of many people, and they do sacrifice the existence, or let's say the financial, or they do sacrifice, let's say, the jobs of some people, and they think that's not important, let's say the culture, and many business fields can no longer work because of the lockdown. So a lot is sacrificed, and what for? Because it's the virus. And if you see that, this is, from my perspective, and I don't say that I'm right, this shows for me that we are willing to sacrifice something and that there is a high value. And for me, I'm wondering if the self is at work with Corona. And I'm wondering if there is a new image of the self emerging and perhaps bringing really a transformation. Why can I ask this question? When you read Marie-Louise von Franz, she described that the images of God, and that's what we know because we can watch it, that the images of God, they are emerging or they are born, and then after some centuries, in a way, they are dying or they die because they are not filled with emotions. They are no longer important, and they fade away in a way. And then a new image can be born, a new image of God, and we are excited and we are enthusiastic or we are fascinated. And it could be, of course, I don't know, that this new image perhaps is emerging now. But at least we see that we are sacrificing a lot, and perhaps it's too early to understand what that means, and if my idea perhaps is really a good idea. That's what I don't know. But yeah, that's at least something I reflected on within the last weeks. So this is what I wanted to say today, and perhaps one last idea. When I'm writing a book, of course, it's about the situation in these months, and then you finish it, and then you continue to develop your ideas, but the book is done, and so it's wonderful to have a dialogue so that one can develop one's own ideas and to discuss it, so yeah, that it's more alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renate. That's lovely. Let me just start with, well, this is a rather big frame, but you have a medical background, so there's things you're aware of. I know that in the last year over COVID, I have told analysts and students and various people that I think it seems that medical people and military people understand a bit better what to do in the face of illness and death. And there is a tendency for, at least maybe better than the rest of us. So many people, of course, there's the very familiar in analysts or in other people, the sort of positive thinking. And then, of course, there are people who will go to the negative when we're trying to contain these enormous forces around the self. There are very light and very dark aspects. Is the ego really ever able to stay in contact with several parts of that at once? Or how do we do that? Or is it?
The question is too big. But how can I say? I use the word self-confidence. The older I am, the more I believe, and it's my experience, that when you want to stay calm in a way, as calm as possible, and we cannot always be calm, and of course we are anxious. And during the first lockdown, I was very irritated. I was in a very difficult state for several reasons. But when you are able to connect and to try to find an answer, and of course, it depends on your own personality, or you mentioned my typology. So how you find the answer, that depends on your personality. But to be connected, I would say that can calm you down. Yeah. But not always, of course. And perhaps at least concerning myself in this crisis last year in March, it's almost a year, I learned a lot about me, and I learned a lot about the world. And as I'm very interested in learning, yeah, and not with books, but with the experience, yeah, um, it helped me to understand more. And this can calm me down. And yeah, depending on your own personality and on your experience, I hope that you find where are, yeah, when I'm connected with the self, I would say you can calm yourself down. And perhaps the task is to find security in the insecurity. Yeah, I don't know if it's a good English.
Yeah,
um,
yes.
uh, to
Difficult task, but a good English.
That's a difficult task, but that's so important. And then you do not always have to plan. You are planning, but you can wait. Yeah. And I see that even in simple situations in daily life, the unconscious can help you, not always. Yeah. Because it's necessary to make mistakes or to fail. That's important. Or as I mentioned, it's not that being connected with the self, that's my experience, it doesn't say that this is always healthy from the definition of health from the WHO. Yeah, because that's the question, what does it mean to be healthy? Yeah, perhaps perhaps it's the task that you exploit yourself, but it's the task that you have to do, and perhaps you stay healthy, but there is no guarantee, and so one shouldn't be naive. And that's perhaps why I'm so interested in the self. Perhaps some are naive and they say, well, then it's the self and then everything is fine. I don't.
No, it's like in mythology when we get commands from the gods.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily good for us. Here are a couple of comments from Elvira Valente. I think they link together. She's saying the coronavirus, would that be a manifestation of the self, the God in us? What do you feel when, let me see. What do you feel when the manifest in analysis, the image of the self? Let me try to put that together. What do you feel when the image of the self is manifested in analysis, I think? Those are big questions also.
Yes. First of all, shall I talk about Corona or in general how?
I think your choice. There's a lot there to react to if you'd like.
Of course, Corona, we are all now in this situation, and it's very difficult to get some distance, yeah, to reflect on it. But isn't it interesting that Corona, we can't see it, and usually we can't see God? And it's so small, but it's so powerful. And that's a definition of Jung. At the same time, it's very small, but it's so powerful. And as I mentioned, we are willing to sacrifice. And many measures that are taken now, if you seriously try to understand, you see there is a lot of irrational. It's very much is irrational. They say it's rational because they say science says it's rational, but that's not the case. Yeah. So there is at least something going on. Yeah. And that, and perhaps we need 2 or 3 years to understand it. So from my perspective, it's something from the collective unconscious. The self, if it's constellated in my life, that's not easy to find out because, as I mentioned, is it something that, let's say, our behavior or our decisions, are they rooted in my persona? Are they rooted in the desire of my ego? Or is it rooted in the self? I would say that the dreams very often are helpful, or especially when the dreams match with something you are doing in the outer world. But it's not so easy. But when you are fascinated, at least then you can say something archetypal is at work. If it's the self, maybe, and then you can say, well, sometimes yeah, it's if you are really how can I say, honest with yourself, sometimes and sometimes you don't know for sure, but perhaps you guess. So there is no proof in a way, but
I feel as though I should go back to your chapters on time, because you're tending to get questions, including the one from me, that are looking for rather fixed answers. And you keep giving answers that are developing through time and changing through time.
Mm-hmm.
Here's something from Craig Nelson. How do you relate the task of the self to the philosopher's stone, the symbol created by the inner talk with images or inner figures? Is this third thing never before seen the task? How would you define meaning, I guess? That's another broad one.
My goodness, your questions are very difficult. So, meaning. That's my personal experience. When the task is from the self, even if it's hard, I would say you experience meaning. Mm. That's my personal experience. It's meaningful, and perhaps others say, how can you do that, or why, or perhaps there are even doubts, but it's yours. Yeah. So, but again, it's the inner experience and the images that are coming perhaps during active imagination or during the dreams, or even your body will say something. But yeah, the meaning is, I would say, when you find the task or what is necessary, then there is a kind of meaning. And perhaps then the self, I would say, very often gives you the power, but that doesn't say that it's healthy, but the self is the source of the power, and perhaps Yeah. But again, you see, my answers are a little bit vague, because it's not a mathematical formula. It's an approach, and perhaps we need to be very old to understand it better. And that's, to be honest, again, that's perhaps what life is for, to understand it better and better, and to learn. But others may see it in a different way.
The purpose. All right.
That's the purpose.
This is Idalina Souza. Yeah. Can the dark part of the self signify a betrayal to the harmony of the ego?
I don't know if it's a betrayal, because for example, we all know that nature is amoral. There is no morality. It's amoral. And morality or ethical questions can only arise because we have the ego and we are conscious. As the mythology or the Bible says, eating from the tree of knowledge means we now know what is good and what is evil, what is fruitful and what is destructive. So only the ego is necessary, yeah, to distinguish it and to make a choice. A wild animal cannot choose. It's within nature, and nature itself is cruel, but it's amoral. So it's like there is new life, and then the animals and the plants have to die, and we need the ego. So for me, the self itself is amoral in a way too. Yeah, but the ego has to make a decision. So for me, it's not a betrayal, but perhaps, I don't know if I understood the question. Idalina, I don't know if you, if it was helpful what I said.
Thank you. This is Paulo Feliga. The discourse on the dark self is very interesting. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate on the integration of evil on a personal level? In my opinion, evil can only be integrated in small doses. What do you think?
Yeah. First of all, very often I don't like that much the word integration, because sometimes it's not possible to integrate it. And as you mentioned, there are small doses perhaps we can integrate or we can balance in a way, and that's perhaps the individual evil. So let's say our personal shadow, but the collective evil, which in former times was called the devil. Or, for example, when you see that there is a large group, when you think about the 6th of January, when the group went to the capital, when you see that there is so much energy, because when many individuals come together, there is so much power that it's too hard to stand it or to dare it. So there is something. Or when you think about the evil within the Nazis, it's not possible to integrate it, I would say. But the attitude, you can have an attitude, and perhaps that's what C.G. Jung described. The question is the ethics. The ego has to make a decision. And on one hand, there is the super ego, which is the collective, let's say, moral answer. And then there is the individual answer. And that's difficult, because sometimes you have to dare something, because you could say the super ego is the standard. It's the mainstream answer concerning the evil. And it can be that you have a different point of view, but then you are alone, and that's difficult. But we cannot, I would say, to use this old image of the devil, that's not possible. That's no.
It is interesting that, yeah.
It's even difficult to integrate or to accept one's own shadow. And to be honest, that's already, Jung said, it's the apprentice is the shadow, and the masterpiece is anima and anima. Today, I wouldn't say it's, I don't agree. I would say the masterpiece is the shadow, at least in our epoch. But that's my opinion.
Well, there's also the question of, for instance, the attack on the Capitol. And I think one can say even the Nazis, at least the rest of us see it and see something in ourselves. I don't know if that helps, but.
Yes, to be honest, I think that's a very important step. To be honest, to see who am I?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Because in the language, the word to be conscious and conscience, they belong together. So morality and being conscious belongs together.
Here's a question from Bernhard. To your personal question, whether hard work is a compensation or a sign of the self coming into the world, into consciousness. How did you find out what it is? I'm not sure I get that, Bernhard, but.
Bernhard, I don't know. Perhaps I have to live longer. I can only say that I have the feeling, I don't know, I have the feeling that right now I'm at the right place and that it is my task. Even if it's not completely healthy, to say it that way. It's not too bad, but I know that sometimes I'm at the limit. But I have the strong feeling that it's my task, and that and I don't know why, but that's it. But of course, one cannot know. Perhaps in 1 year, that's what I don't know. But I can't say more. But I'm wondering, and I try to keep this question in mind. Yeah, and so I can only say I have the feeling, and but if there is a new information from my unconscious or from the world, then one day I will tell you if it's different.
Here's this is from Dennis Merritt. Dennis, this is a dense question. This has several levels to it. Winnicott was very interested in Jung's fear of his mother and how that deeply affected his sense of self, as seen in the fearful dimensions of personality number 2 from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Do you think you had a sense of the dark side of the self? Dennis, do you think Jung had a sense of the dark side of the self, or do you think you had a sense of the dark side of the self in relation to his experience of his mother, who still puzzled him in the Freeman interview 2 years before he died? That must be, do you think Jung had a sense of the dark side of the self in relation to his experience of his mother? That was pretty cumbersome explanation. Did you get it?
To be honest, I don't know. But when you read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he saw his father suffering because as a priest, it seems he couldn't believe. And then, of course, he experienced his mother, and that's a kind of mystery, and you don't know. And of course, there are these dark aspects, and perhaps they were very important. That's what I don't know. But of course, it can be, but I don't know.
This is from Karen Chan. This is a big one, but I think you can answer that if you have time. How do we conceptualize the self from a developmental lens? What is the relationship of young children to the self?
From a Jungian perspective, the ego in a way emerges from the self. In the beginning, there is only the self. And you need to be able as a human being to say, I want, I see, I'm aware, or I remember. So we all do not know consciously anything about our time as a baby. Yeah, we don't remember, but it's of course stored in our body. It's not forgotten, but it's not possible to remember it in a conscious way. So there is, first of all, there is a development of the ego, and the ego is the part in our psyche that is able to reflect, as I mentioned, to be aware, to be conscious. And you have to be independent, and children are very close to the self. And we see that even in fairy tale, because usually the youngest son or the youngest daughter in a way is the stupid one, but he is the successful one. And the youngest aspect in us is close to the self, or is close to the unconscious. Yeah. And so the farther the ego is away from the unconscious aspect of the psyche, from the self, and this includes the instincts. I mentioned only once, the body belongs to the self, and of course the instincts. So when you are close to the instincts, then the ego is closer to the self, because the instincts are at least an aspect of the self. So that's important, and I wanted to say something, and I'm a little bit tired and forgot.
Sorry, apologies. It is later where you are, I know.
But the development, I would say, now I know what I wanted to say. We are living in an epoch where there is the tendency to be more and more disconnected with the instincts. And we see that because we have so many problems with the instincts. Instincts is eating. I'm hungry or I'm not hungry. So the eating disorders, sexuality, all the perversions and problems we have with sexuality. Then sleeping, this is something natural. All the sleeping disorders. So we see we have so many problems with our instincts, and the instincts belong to the self. And I guess that shows that our lifestyle is a problem, that we have a problem with nature, and nature belongs to the self. Yeah. And the child is closer to the self, of course, because it's not, the ego is not that much developed and not adapted. And when you mentioned time, because in former times, time belonged to God, and today time from our perspective does no longer belong to God. So you see, for a child, the child wants to wake up and there is an inner rhythm, but we say, look, we have to go to the kindergarten, you have to hurry up. So the child, the education wants the child to adapt to our lifestyle. And so you are more and more disconnected from the self. And so our task is, in a way, not to be childish, not to go back, but to reconnect in a different way. And that's sometimes, yeah, not so easy.
Difficult. From Stefano, here's a fairly specific one. Sorry, the page moved. How can you differentiate between, quote, it is my task, as you suggested, versus an inflation or a hypomanic state?
Yeah, inflation belongs to the self. Inflation, without inflation, we would not have, for example, you mentioned that I studied medicine, we would not have the medicine that we have today. You have to cross borders, and that's dangerous. And sometimes it's necessary. It's both. Yeah. And that's the question. Because you know that many physicians, they tried something, they made an experiment, and they brought something to the world that helps many people, but for them it was dangerous. So when you see Prometheus, for example, in a way, yeah, you have to take something from the self, and it's dangerous, and that's inflation. So without that, there is no progress, but perhaps it can be dangerous. So I would say, yeah, many aspects, or at least these aspects.
Several other comments. Let's see. Okay. I'm not seeing another clear question. We have 10 minutes left. Do more people have questions you'd like to ask? Because clearly people are interested. So is there anything that that is coming to your mind that you'd like to say, Renate, given the number of things we have asked you and the number of ideas that are going on here? Well, experiences, not just ideas.
Well, how can I say, there are several aspects I'm fascinated with. One is this question of disobedience, yeah, that you see in the Bible or in mythology. The question is, when do you dare to disobey? And it's necessary to develop, but it's a risk. That's one aspect that fascinates me. And perhaps that it's not always healthy, as I mentioned, yeah, to accept the task of the self. And yeah, and perhaps that even we try to approach it, it's a mystery. Yeah. And it's the mystery of life. And perhaps yeah, that yeah, and the dark self, when we talked a little bit about that, before I studied at the Jung Institute, when I worked at hospital, from the very beginning, I had to do a lot to get the possibility to work in the department of the forensic patients. I hope I... Yes. And so I was always interested in the dark self. I always wanted to understand it. Why is that possible? So one could say this, I was always interested in that. Yeah. And there are always, step by step, the older I am, there are more answers, but it's only an approach. Yeah. And so perhaps I would say, that's perhaps something when you reflect, what does it mean to be interested in something? That the interest does not come from the ego. You cannot decide when you wake up in the morning, today I will be interested in mathematics when you are a student. No, you cannot decide it. You can do the homework, you can be disciplined, but the interest is something. So I would say this is coming from the soul. And so it's interesting to see, perhaps at the age of 20, you were interested in that, and then you lost it, and then something new came. So there is something in the soul that wants you to go perhaps into depth. And that's perhaps, that's perhaps important. Do I allow my ego, to follow this interest? Is it dangerous, or do I even dare to do it?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever happens, and even if it's a risk. So these are the for me, very important questions. And the ego can make the decision, but not always, because if the interest is very intense, sometimes you are not free. And so if it's an interest or a fascination that is rooted in the self, you are not that free. Yeah. So that's for me something I'm very interested in experiencing that, and of course with the clients. And that's perhaps why I'm convinced that Jungian psychology is so important today, because many people are asking, what about meaning? What is life for? And I think that the Jungian psychology, with these concepts and the experience, can help others to find that. Yeah.
And now there are a lot of rather rich questions. I know this might be a bit tiring, so do tell us when you've had a long day. I know. Carol Mora, I'm wondering if, considering the ego-self axis idea from Neumann and later Edinger, would the notion of the false self be connected with either alienation or inflation?
From a Jungian perspective, as I mentioned, the false self cannot exist. That's what I think, because the self is the totality of the person, or the inner center, and that's not false. It exists, or whatever it is. But of course, it can be that my relationship with the self, that I'm disconnected, or that something is difficult. Yeah. So for me, I would prefer to say there is a false ego, or the ego is fragile. And if the ego is fragile, this is not too easy to find out, because I guess many of you, or perhaps all of you, know that there are very successful people, perhaps honored and so on, but then sometimes there is a crisis, and then you are shocked how fragile they are, because, as I use the word, self-confidence, or that they are not connected with the self, that then you know that they compensated something, and then it's very often not too difficult to find out that it's a lot of compensation, that they are able to show something, but underneath there is a lot of fragility. They are not connected with the unconscious. They are not able to contain the material, or whatever comes, or whatever is hidden in the unconscious. So sometimes you need the crisis, you need a loss, in order to really understand, or to see, or to experience what about the ego. And that's so for me, the false self does not exist. I don't use the word.
By the way, when we speak of compensation, I assume traditionally we are often thinking of compensation in relation to the ego, would there be any compensation in relation to the self that you are speaking of? Or would that just not make sense?
I haven't thought about that, but let's say it that way. When I'm now try to think or to recollect my work, of course, we all project the image of the selves, as you know, on parents or on leaders. Of course, we are interested that somebody is like the Father God who has to solve the problems. We delegate it to them. So it can be that your own mother complex or your father complex and the archetypal core that belongs to that you try to compensate something. And of course, that's the task of the ego. But yeah, it's not solved in a way. Yeah, it's fragile, because only as long as you can do it the way you did it in the past, yeah, then it works. But as soon as there is a crisis, it doesn't work. So perhaps it's possible, but I have to think about it.
All right. Thank you very much. There is a host of new questions, but I think we are running low on time, and it is late where you are, Renate, I know. In 2 weeks, a bit over 2 weeks, we will see Marion Dunley, who will speak about her body dreaming work and her book. And then 2 weeks after that, we will have a book launch that is faintly involved with one of us. Stefano Carpani has edited The Plural Turn, a book on Andrew Samuel's work, and we'll have a book launch on that in about a month, 28th of April. So is there anything else you'd like to say, Renate, or?
No, thank